Since it is officially after 12 by 1 minute, we'll start to get the ball rolling. So hi, everyone. We're so glad that you are here for today's program. My name is Shay Corey, and I serve as the programs manager for the DC Preservation League. I'm joined today by our fantastic speaker, Dr. Tanya Golash-Boza, our executive director of DCPL, Rebecca Miller, and our community outreach and grants manager, Zachary Burt, who is live streaming this event on Facebook. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C. citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have a few things to go over before we get started. First, I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, Kutak Rock, Douglas Development Corporation, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Robert Benson Photography, Buyer Blinder Bell, Building Innovation Hub, Edens, EHT Tracers Inc., KCE Structural Engineers, Quinn Evans, and David Schwartz Architects. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation here in DC. I'd also like to thank Jim Myers and Joe Levesque of the Bloomingdale Historic District for generously sponsoring this month's programming centered on gentrification in neighborhoods. Moving on, I just have a few notes on how today's webinar is going to run. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box that is located at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, and we'll go through those towards the end of the program. For those joining on Facebook, Zach will monitor your questions there and send them to us over here in Zoom. And now that we've covered all of that, I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Tanya Golash-Boza, who is the founder of the Racism, Capitalism, and the Law Lab, a professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced, and the executive director of the University of California, Washington Center. She's a prolific scholar with several published books and dozens of academic articles and book chapters. She's received several awards, including the Distinguished Contribution to Research Book Award from the Latino Studies section of the American Sociological Association for her book, Deported: Immigrant Policing, Disposable Labor, and Global Capitalism, published by New York University Press in 2015. Her textbook, Race and Racism: A Critical Approach, published by Oxford University Press, is now in its third edition and is the leading textbook in this field. Her latest book, Before Gentrification: The Creation of DC's Racial Wealth Gap, will be released by the University of California Press in July of 2023. And with that, I am excited to turn things over to you, Tanya.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Give me 1 second to turn this on. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the generous introduction. I'm very excited to share my work with you, and thank you to everyone for showing up on this cloudy afternoon to listen to my talk about DC before gentrification and how we got here. So white people in the United States have, on average, 8 times the wealth of Black people. And wealth is important because it can be used to create opportunities, maintain financial security, and pass along a legacy to the next generation. And this is particularly the case in the United States, where an unexpected medical bill can put you in lifelong debt. And it's nearly impossible to send your children to university without significant wealth unless you want to put them in lifelong debt. People who study wealth inequality in the United States focus on home ownership because inequality in home equity accounts for most of the racial wealth gap. White people have more wealth than Black people in large part because white people are more likely to own homes and therefore to have home equity. Home equity refers to the amount of money that your home is worth minus any money that you owe on the mortgage. So there's a significant racial home ownership gap in the United States. Less than half of Black people own the home where they live, as compared to 3/4 of white people. Activists have long fought to narrow the racial home ownership gap because of its relationship to the racial wealth gap. So it seems logical that we can narrow the wealth gap by promoting Black home ownership. But is this actually true? So I'm going to answer this question today through a discussion of how home ownership has created wealth in white communities, whereas Black communities in Washington, D.C. have been subjected to disinvestment, carceral investment, and gentrification. And what I'm going to share with you today is based on a larger project focused on Washington, D.C. that includes a broad range of both primary and secondary sources. I'm not going to bore you with the details of the data and methods right now, but if you have any questions about where I get my information from, I'm more than happy to answer those during the Q&A. So one thing to note is that in today's talk, I'm going to mention 4 neighborhoods. All 4 of these neighborhoods were nearly all white until the 1950s, but they've all changed in really different ways since. So Chevy Chase has stayed primarily white and primarily upper middle class. Mount Pleasant was also primarily white in the 1950s, and by the 1970s, it was integrated, but still majority homeowners. And Petworth had been primarily white, but by the 1970s had become majority Black, but still also majority homeowners. And Anacostia, which had been majority white in the 1950s, by the 1970s was majority Black and primarily renters. So let's talk today about white homeownership and white wealth. So the assumption that home ownership will lead to wealth accumulation is based on the experiences of white homeowners. For white people, home ownership has translated into intergenerational wealth because homes that white people own have consistently increased in value. So white people benefited from federally subsidized home ownership programs created in the aftermath of the Great Depression that allowed them to get favorable terms on their mortgages. White neighborhoods featured well-funded schools, and school quality is highly correlated with home values. This combination of government funding and community assets allowed white people's homes to increase in value, therefore giving them more home equity and more wealth. I'm just going to explain each of these things a little bit more. So let's first talk about federally subsidized loans. Between 1933 and 1978, federal government subsidies enabled over 35 million families in the United States to purchase homes. As a direct consequence of federal policies, home ownership became the primary vehicle for wealth accumulation. By the early 20th century, by the early 21st century, 60% of middle-class Americans' assets were in the form of home equity. So basically, if you're middle class, like not super rich, almost all of the wealth that you're likely to have is going to be in the value of your home. So these families are now going to pass on trillions of dollars of wealth to their children through accumulated home equity. So the federal policies that encouraged home ownership in the 1930s and 1940s primarily benefited white people. So one example of a federal policy that primarily benefited white people is when the Federal Housing Administration underwrote loans to make it easier for families to secure mortgages. However, only 2% of the mortgages underwritten by the Federal Housing Administration between 1945 and 1959 went to Black families. This is because the Federal Housing Administration designated Black neighborhoods as high risk. Now, since the FHA didn't underwrite loans in Black areas, banks denied loans to home buyers in areas where Black people lived. And this practice is generally referred to as redlining because the federal government literally created color-coded maps which shaded red those areas where Black people live. There's a government agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and they created most of the redlining maps that you've seen in other venues. Now, no researcher has found a Homeowners Loan Corporation map for Washington, D.C. However, the researchers at Prologue DC found this map, which was made in 1937 by the Federal Housing Administration. So what we're looking at here is the original map, and this is a color-coded version that they made to make it a little easier to see. So the areas that the Federal Housing Administration designated as low risk for mortgage underwriting, they shaded those areas in green. And the areas that the Federal Housing Administration designated as high risk in 1937 are shaded in red, and then the little bubbles represent the number of Black people. So as you can see, the areas that had high concentrations of Black people in the 1930s were designated as high risk for loans, and those areas that had few to no Black people were designated as low risk. So this map makes it clear that the Federal Housing Administration only designated areas as suitable for mortgage underwriting when few to no Black people live there. So after creating this map, the Federal Housing Administration ensured 5 times as many mortgages in the primarily white suburbs as it did in Washington, D.C. And within D.C., nearly all the FHA subsidized mortgages went to the upper northwestern areas of the city, which at that time were nearly all white. So today, the federal government no longer creates maps that deem majority Black areas as high risk for mortgages. Nevertheless, banks' discriminatory practices continued throughout the 20th century. There was a study that found that only 3% of the mortgages made by the Chevy Chase Federal Savings Bank between 1976 and 1982 were in DC neighborhoods that were not white. And then also someone interviewed an employee at the time who explicitly told them that they were told at the Chevy Chase Savings Bank not to issue mortgages south of Calvert Street or east of Connecticut Avenue, with exceptions only for Capitol Hill and DuPont Circle. So this is unofficial redlining, where certain neighborhoods are deemed high risk and other neighborhoods are deemed low risk. So the Federal Housing Administration was one of just many parties that helped create this idea that homes in white areas are more desirable than homes in Black areas. The nascent real estate industry also helped create this idea that homes in all white communities would sell for a higher price. So real estate textbooks and the Washington Real Estate Board's Code of Ethics explicitly promoted racial segregation. So the picture that you're looking at here is 1930s Petworth, and this neighborhood was built explicitly as a white community and marketed as a white community. So one way that real estate agencies were able to promote racial segregation is through racial deed covenants. These are contractual agreements in deeds that prohibit the sale or rental of properties to Black people. So developers use these covenants to prevent African Americans from purchasing most of the homes built during the housing boom of the early to mid 20th century. The researchers at Prolog DC have identified tens of thousands of covenants and petitions in DC. So this map marks racial deed covenants in red and petition covenants in blue. So petition covenants are when residents got together and made an agreement not to sell or rent their homes to Black people. So in one example, in 1946, residents of Randolph Street in Petworth banded together to sign an agreement to borrow Black residents for 50 years. So the creation of all white subdivisions in the metropolitan Washington area was made possible through the combined forces of several parties. These include the Federal Housing Administration, developers, and then white citizens associations. So these people all work together to create a segregated city. And these practices cemented the idea that white neighborhoods were economically and socially desirable. And these practices also spelled the end of most integrated neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., and set the stage for how private and public funds would be spent for decades to come. The effect of their combined efforts was to redirect resources away from Black communities and towards white communities. So in addition to subsidizing loans in white areas, the government also invested in public amenities, including highways, water systems, and public schools in white areas. Today, I'm just going to focus on schools, just to give you an idea of the disparities and how the racial composition of a neighborhood has shaped public investment in neighborhoods in DC. So by 1970, DC schools were extremely segregated. 99% of Black students in DC attended majority Black schools. That made the DC public school system the most segregated school in the country. And there was a very small number of white students in the DCPS system in 1990, about 7%, and almost all of them attended schools west of the park in areas that were nearly all white. So the greatest disparities in schooling were between the schools west of the park and those schools east of the Anacostia River, where students were nearly all Black and nearly all low income. So there's a court case that revealed that in 1971, there were 18 students per teacher west of the park as compared to 22 students per teacher in Anacostia. Then schools in Anacostia, and then the average test scores west of the park were 2.4 grades higher than the rest of the city. People in white neighborhoods benefited from federally subsidized loans, as well as public investments, which in turn increased their home equity and their wealth. This is because home values reflect not only the brick and mortar of the structures, but also the quality of the schools, the type of local businesses and neighborhood amenities, as well as the racial composition of the community. So that's white homeownership and white wealth. As you can see, the federal government invested heavily in primarily white communities, and that led to homes in white communities being valued very highly. But Black people also purchased homes in the housing boom of the mid-20th century. So only 1 in 5 Black people lived in homes they owned in 1940. But by 1950, 1 in 3 Black people lived in homes they owned. And by 1970, over 40% of Black people lived in homes that they owned. So there was an increase in home ownership among Black people in the mid-20th century. And notably, there was a greater percentage increase in Black home ownership than white home ownership each decade between 1940 and 1970. And in Washington, D.C., this was particularly notable. The number of Black homeowners in Washington, D.C. increased 6-fold between 1940 and 1970. And by 1970, there were nearly 45,000 Black homeowners in Washington, D.C. Despite this growth in home ownership for Black people in D.C., we continue to see significant wealth inequality. In the Washington metropolitan area, white people have 81 times the wealth of Black people. So high rates of home ownership in the Black population in D.C. did not reduce the wealth gap. So why is this the case? So let's just take a closer look at how Black people were able to purchase homes in DC in the 1950s. So African Americans were able to purchase homes in all-white neighborhoods due to a Supreme Court decision that racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable. So as of 1948, even though those covenants continue to exist in deeds, and if you own a home in DC, you can look up your deed and see if the language is in there, but that language is still there in some deeds, but it's not enforceable. But then there was another really important Supreme Court decision in 1954, which is Bowling v. Sharp, which is the companion case to Brown versus the Board of Education. And that decision ordered schools to desegregate. When the order to desegregate happened, white people began to leave the city in droves, making it possible for thousands of Black people to move into those areas formerly restricted to whites. So Dr. Clarence Hinton was one of those African Americans who purchased a home during this time. And when Dr. Hinton purchased his home at 13th and Farragut Streets Northwest, he was the first Black person on his block. Over the next 20 years, Dr. Hinton's block became all Black. So white flight happened across the city. The white population of Washington, D.C. decreased by 1/3 in a generation. And that's how Petworth went from all white to all Black. So white flight also opened up home ownership opportunities for Black people. And by 1980, there were over 50,000 Black homeowners in DC, but this has not translated into intergenerational wealth. So Black homeownership didn't lead to Black wealth. And one of the main reasons is that many homes in Black neighborhoods did not increase in value during the latter half of the 20th century. So what happened? Why did homes in white neighborhoods increase in value, but not homes in Black neighborhoods? We can see that simply increasing access to homeownership is unlikely to diminish the wealth gap because neighborhoods where Black people live have consistently experienced disinvestment. And this is what needs to change, not just homeownership rates. So white neighborhoods got federal subsidies and good schools, and Black neighborhoods experienced disinvestment. So disinvestment is when the public and private sectors stop investing in the well-being of community. And this necessarily happens after some investment has taken place. So we don't call an undeveloped tract of land disinvested, it's just undeveloped. In the case of Black neighborhoods in DC, there's a clear pattern of these neighborhoods receiving high levels of investment when they were majority white, and then receiving significant disinvestment as they became majority Black. So segregation allowed the state to redirect resources away from Black communities and towards white communities. Areas that were historically or had become primarily Black experienced both public and private disinvestment. Segregation facilitates racial disparities in public and private investment because decision makers can choose whether to make investments in Black or in white communities. And by the 1980s, DC public housing and the DC public school system almost exclusively served the Black community, and these two public goods were greatly diminished due to disinvestment. Let's go back to Dr. Hinton's story. So when Dr. Hinton purchased his home on 13th and Farragut Streets Northwest in 1953, His white neighbors were not very happy that he was there, and they tried to prevent him from moving into the neighborhood. But over the next 40 years, his family would watch nearly all of their white neighbors leave. And they would simultaneously experience significant declines in the quality of the public school and a lack of city services. So let's take a close look at what happened to Theodore Roosevelt High School. And this is the high school that serves the Petworth community and the school that Dr. Hinton's daughters attended. So Roosevelt High was desegregated in 1954 and became majority Black within a few years. Roosevelt High had been an excellent school prior to desegregation, and it continued to provide a first-rate education at least until the 1970s. So when Bonnie Benson, the daughter of Ezra Taft Benson, Secretary of Agriculture, enrolled in Roosevelt High in 1955, it was a blue ribbon school noted for high standards of scholarship and its record of sending a large percentage of its students to college. You have to wonder, when's the last time a major government official has sent their child to Roosevelt High School? And that may have been the last one right there in 1955. And so when Bonnie Benson went with her father on an official trip to Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, she took the school's yearbook with her and proudly showed off the photos of Black and white students playing and working together, sort of celebrating integration, showing how wonderful it was in the United States, and Black and white people were going to school together, getting along together, playing together. But every year that Bonnie attended Roosevelt, more white students left the school. And by the time Bonnie was preparing for graduation in 1958, the school had become nearly 80% Black, and soon it would become virtually all Black. And Bonnie also likely did not mention to the international community that the swimming pool at Roosevelt closed when the high school was integrated. That was in 1954. The swimming pool at Roosevelt High School just opened again, like a couple of years ago. So that just shows you the many, many decades of disinvestment that Petworth experienced since the 1950s. So as Roosevelt High became majority Black, it did continue to offer an excellent education to Black students. Dr. Hinton's and his daughter Audrey to Roosevelt in 1961, 7 years after the school was first integrated. And many of Audrey's classmates have done exceedingly well. Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, who graduated from Roosevelt in 1964, became the first Black woman to earn a doctorate at MIT. Sharon Pratt became the mayor of DC, and Dr. Charlene Drew Jarvis became the first president of Southeastern University. So these highly successful Black women all attended Roosevelt High School in the 1950s and 1960s. However, by 1992, Roosevelt had ranked nearly last at 16 out of 17 schools in DC for its promotion rate. 1 in 3 students who enrolled in the 9th grade at Roosevelt did not graduate from high school. And in that same year, only 33 of Roosevelt's 915 students enrolled in AP classes, and not one of them passed the advanced placement exam. So Roosevelt High went from being one of the best schools in the city in the 1960s to one of the worst by the 1980s. Now, schools are often reflections of their neighborhoods. So what had changed? And the short answer is the race of the neighborhood residents. The area surrounding Petworth remained relatively similar in terms of socioeconomic status and home ownership rates. The main thing that changed in that neighborhood is the neighborhood went from being over 90% white to over 90% Black. And as Roosevelt and most of the other public schools in DC became majority Black, they experienced disinvestment. In Petworth and other Black neighborhoods in DC, public schools experienced disinvestment in the aftermath of white flight. As white people were fleeing the city, Black people were arriving in large numbers. So the city's school population grew from 100,000 to 150,000 students between 1954 and 1970, and Congress did not allocate enough funds to the public school system to accommodate this growth, and the school system, which already had problems, worsened. So keep in mind, this is prior to home rule. So in the 1950s and 1960s and up until 1975, Congress basically controlled DC's budget. So in 1985, a group of parents called Parents United issued a report comparing Coolidge High, a majority Black high school in Washington, D.C., with 2 schools in the primarily white suburbs, Marshall High in Fairfax County, Virginia, and Rockville High in Montgomery County, Maryland. And despite similar enrollments, Coolidge had fewer teachers, counselors, athletic teams, and library books. Notably, the budget for athletic coaches was 8 times as high at Rockville High, and the school spent nearly twice as much money per pupil as Coolidge. And schools also had structural deficiencies, as you can see in these pictures of Coolidge from 1985. 20 years after these pictures were taken, a group of DC public schools parents concluded that despite their decades of advocacy, most schools are still in need of significant repairs to bathrooms, doors, windows, roofs, and heating and cooling systems. Structural hazards continue to threaten school safety. So again, decades of disinvestments in schools like Coolidge and Roosevelt, which were schools where Black middle-class children were attending. So some of the people that we interviewed for this project went to Coolidge and directly felt the effects of disinvestment. So one person that we interviewed was Troy, and Troy joined the football team at Coolidge, which kept him busy. However, his coach, who was struggling with crack addiction, often failed to show up for practice. Troy explained that football kept him out of trouble at first, but with the coach not coming up to practice, there wasn't that really good equipment. He started to feel demotivated. So Troy explained to me, and I was on the football team, and by the time you go to practice, you're trying to go home, eat, and go to sleep. There wasn't any time to be outside or anything like that. So once the coach stopped showing up, that fell apart. So when Troy found himself as a young teenage boy with large amounts of free time after dropping off the football team, Troy began to sell drugs, and that eventually led to him spending 10 years behind bars. So for Troy and many other youth in the city in the 1980s, disinvestment in public schools meant that they ultimately turned to the streets. Troy was just one of many Black youth who became involved in selling crack cocaine. Crack cocaine stepped in to fill the gaps left wide open as both the public and private sectors abandoned the city. By 1990, half of all Black youth in DC were unemployed. And by 1997, half of Black male youth in DC were under the control of the criminal legal system. With high unemployment and failing schools, young men began to sell crack in open-air drug markets to make ends meet, and crack was lucrative. The turf wars and gun violence ensued. By 1991, Washington, D.C. had the highest homicide rate in the country. And Petworth was not immune to this. So although Petworth was a Black middle-class neighborhood, it still had a tremendously high homicide rate. And nearly all the homicide victims in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s and 1990s were young Black men. The city's response to the problems created by the violence of disinvestment was not to begin to invest in schools and communities in ways that would support them. Instead, the response was to invest in prisons and policings in ways that would punish them. In DC and across the country, the local and federal government began a war on drugs that would devastate Black communities for generations. And the war on drugs in DC marked a significant shift in budget priorities. So in 1984, when DC Council Chairman David Clark presented his $2.1 billion budget request to Congress, he opened with these remarks. The programmatic priorities of this budget are the priorities of our citizens: jobs, housing, education, youth, senior citizen services, programs for people in need of medical and social services, and economic development. By the time of these comments, the departure of white residents and then of the Black middle class had shrunk the city's tax base, which left the city without the revenue it needed to attend to the needs of its remaining residents. But by the end of the 1980s, the economic crisis in the city had only deepened. Nevertheless, the city's focus had shifted firmly away from social services and towards the war on drugs. Crack took center stage, and this was clear in the city's budget hearings. In a 1989 congressional hearing on appropriations, Mayor Marion Barry referred to the war on drugs as the city's #1 priority. And this was not just a verbal commitment. In that same hearing, Marion Barry explained that this prioritization meant the city had funneled more money towards law enforcement and corrections. The city redirected nearly $80 million away from the Department of Public Works, the Department of Housing and Community Development, the Department of Recreation, the Department of Employment Services, and the University of the District of Columbia, and towards law enforcement and corrections. The city's $3 billion budget for 1990 included just $20 million for drug treatment as compared to $227 million for corrections. The city's overwhelming response to the problems associated with the drug trade was to strengthen the coercive arm of the state. Instead of paying for parks and libraries, the city took the path of carceral investment. Instead of addressing the root problems of failing schools and widespread economic precarity, the city focused on the symptom, which was the spread of crack and its attendant violence. By 1997, fully half of young Black men in DC were under the control of the criminal legal system. Black men in DC had an incarceration rate 36 times that of white men. The rate of incarceration in DC rose steadily from about 400 per 100,000 residents in 1978 to a peak of 1,712 people incarcerated per 100,000 residents in 1994. And this was 4.4 times the national rate and the highest incarceration rate in the world. So by the 1990s, 4,000 Black men had been murdered, public schools were failing, and the Black middle class was leaving the city for Prince George's County and other parts of the country. So in this context, the city's population changed significantly. The city went from 71% Black in 1970 to 41% Black in 2020. As the Black population has decreased, the white population has increased. So this displacement of the Black population from DC has happened through gentrification. So this brings us to our last point, which is how disinvestment, heavy policing, mass incarceration, and stagnant home values set the stage for gentrification and the displacement of the Black population from DC. In 1970, Petworth was a majority Black community with half of Black families living in homes they owned. Today, the neighborhood is only 50% Black, and there are only 3,000 Black homeowners in Petworth. So Black people who purchased a home in Petworth in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, or 80s would not see a return on this investment for decades. The median value of homes in Petworth remained steady from 1980 to 2000, meaning that if you bought a home in Petworth in 1980, this would not lead to increased wealth. It also means that it would be difficult to take out a second mortgage to complete expensive home repairs on these homes that were built in the 1930s. The rise in home value in Petworth began in the 2000s, corresponding with the arrival of non-Black residents into the neighborhood and a decline in the number of Black homeowners. So in Petworth, the two-story brick homes built for white people in the early 20th century have become attractive to white buyers again. The twin forces of gun violence and the prison system took young Black men out of the neighborhood. The mass exodus of white residents in the mid-20th century and then of the Black middle class in the late 20th century created the conditions for gentrification in the early 21st century. Now it was profitable for investors to purchase devalued houses, abandoned properties, and foreclosed homes to build new homes for new people. Disinvestment combined with low housing prices, record low interest rates, and tax incentives made Petworth attractive to investors after decades of abandonment. According to a report from Redfin, the average gain of a home flip in Petworth was $337,000 in 2016, which was higher than any other neighborhood in the United States. Other DC neighborhoods where investors took in high profits on home sales include Brookland and Brightwood, which are neighborhoods that adjoin Petworth. The Hintons, which I mentioned earlier, purchased their home in 1953 for about $20,000. They lived in the neighborhood for 45 years before selling their home in 1998 for $230,000. That makes for a very small profit on a 45-year investment once we take inflation into account. The people who bought the home from them sold it in 2019 for $700,000, which is a fair profit for a 20-year investment. 5 months later, the home sold for $1.3 million, which is a considerable profit for these investors. These investors made more money on the Hinton home in less than 6 months than the Hintons did in 45 years. When Petworth was primarily Black, it experienced disinvestment. This disinvestment worked in various ways to depopulate the neighborhood, making it an optimal site for reinvestment. Today, Petworth has become profitable once again, but it's also become unaffordable for long-term residents. And there are three reasons why home ownership did not translate into wealth in Petworth and other neighborhoods. First of all, home values were stagnant for decades in Black neighborhoods, which put a serious dent in Black people's ability to build wealth. Secondly, the joblessness crisis of the 1980s meant that few Black children were raised in homes with two working parents. And thirdly, contemporary labor market disparities between white and Black people in DC mean that there are relatively few cases where Black people are earning enough to purchase homes in DC. In 2016, the unemployment rate of Black residents of DC was 17%, which is 5 times the rate of white people, which was 3% unemployment rate. So decades of disinvestment in Black neighborhoods in DC means that home values remain stagnant, preventing Black homeowners from accumulating wealth through home ownership. Schools in Black homeowning communities had high dropout and low college enrollment rates in the 1980s and 1990s. And when we add to this equation the carceral investment these neighborhoods experienced during the war on drugs, it becomes clear how and why Black families in DC have had difficulty maintaining home ownership across generations. So an analysis that draws from theories of racial capitalism can help us to understand this process. And I'll just end with this description to sort of contextualize the issues. So today, the land that encompasses Washington, D.C. is worth billions of dollars. But this value is not inherent to the land itself, but was created through a series of dispossessions and displacements. These dispossessions and displacements made capitalism possible. The process of capitalist accumulation began with primitive accumulation, whereby the indigenous residents were expelled and a system of exclusive property rights was imposed. This process of accumulation by dispossession began with the commodification and privatization of land, which imbued land with monetary value in the first place. And then the value of this land was enhanced through the labor of enslaved persons who were forced to clear trees to make way for boulevards, dig ditches, which become streets, make and lay bricks for houses, and quarry and transport stones to build the White House. So the history of Black communities in DC is one of dispossession, displacement, and disinvestment. And these processes are rooted both in racial capitalism, which is an economic system that organizes and justifies exploitation by racial classification, and an anti-Blackness, which is an anti-social logic that not only dehumanizes Black people, but also renders abject all that is associated with Blackness. And it's through this objection that decision makers have implemented policies that have led to the displacement and dispossession of Black people and decades of disinvestment in Black communities. Although the labor of Black people enhanced the value of the land, today the presence of Black people can lead to a devaluation of the land. And as geographer Catherine McKittrick explains, places associated with Blackness often become sites of environmental, social, and infrastructural decay and geographic surveillance. So the ease which with Black people have been systematically and repeatedly displaced from DC through dispossession of their lands, foreclosure of their homes, policing, and the carceral system is rooted in anti-Blackness. So when I share this work with other groups, people often ask, what is to be done? How can we avoid these cycles of displacement and dispossession? My response to these questions is twofold. On the one hand, we can support affordable housing developments and inclusionary zoning programs that allow people without intergenerational wealth to purchase homes. The expansion of these programs would definitely benefit many people who struggle to afford housing. We can also reinvest in Black communities in ways that do not lead to the displacement of Black people. The people I interviewed were not opposed to the new amenities that have accompanied gentrification. Their primary objection was to being displaced. At the same time, the more that I think about the history and the present day of housing in Washington, D.C., it becomes increasingly clear that these remedial solutions can only go so far. As the United States has moved completely away from public housing and left nearly all housing solutions to the private market, we've created a situation where one of our most fundamental human rights, the right to shelter, has been left to market forces. And the only real solution thus lies in the decommodification of housing. A real solution requires a reimagining of, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore has put it, everything. We've created a racialized economic system where, to the extent that middle-class people have any wealth at all, that wealth lies in the value of their home. Yet the simple fact of a home, and particularly a neighborhood, being occupied by Black people decreases the value of that home. The barriers to wealth accumulation for Black people are not a bug in the system of racial capitalism, but a feature. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was such an eye-opening talk, and we do have some questions for you. We did have a question about what we can do, and I think that you already answered that one. But we do have a question. Given the gross historic disinvestment, I'm wondering if you have seen bright spots of organizations reinvesting and returning citizens and providing them homeownership and other wealth building opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Washington, D.C. does have a couple of features that are available and that have been used with great success. So first of all, we do have the inclusionary zoning program. The problem is it's just too small. So the inclusionary zoning program basically means that if you are middle to low income, you're eligible to purchase a home at a reduced rate. So there are homes in Petworth, basically on Kennedy Street, that are for sale right now for between $150,000 and $250,000. And if you qualify for these homes, you can purchase them, which is great. But that meets about 5% of the need, right? So it's a very small program, unfortunately, and it certainly could be expanded. And then also DC has cooperative housing as well. So we do have cooperative housing, which is like basically decommodifying housing. So a cooperative, it's a building. So let's say a building is going up for sale. We do have a law where the tenants can purchase the building, and then the tenants can collectively own that building, and they can set the terms at which the houses can be sold. And in that case, the tenants are owning the building, and the main benefit to them is that their rent is not going to just double from one month to the next because they're the ones that are in charge. They don't build wealth through that because it is decommodified, but it is a more sustainable solution because basically it allows for the persistence of affordable housing. And I'll just also say, when we think about affordable housing in the DC, we have to remember that, that means that people who work at at Starbucks, at the coffee shops, at Target, at McDonald's, also should be able to afford housing. And right now, there's very little housing for low-wage working people in Washington, DC. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Shay.
Classic Zoom. How can policies, consumers, and home buyers reinvest without displacing?
It's a good question. And, I grew up in Petworth, and there is, it's great to have the restaurants and the wine bars and the pizzerias and the coffee shops there. I don't think anyone is really opposed to those businesses being there. We might ask, why weren't they here 30 years ago? Because it is a Black middle-class neighborhood. So middle-class people live there and have been able to purchase things for a very long time. So I don't think there's, so it's good to see this reinvestment. I think and it's hard to answer that question in the abstract, but what I will say is that people need to, if people want to not participate in the displacement and dispossession, one thing that I have noticed in places like Petworth is that a lot of new people have moved in, but what hasn't really changed are the public schools. So, Brightwood Elementary School, for example, is still like 99% Black and Latinx, even as the neighborhood around it changes. So that means that the white people that are moving into that neighborhood are not sending their children to those public schools. And when you don't have, and those new people are going to be kind of by definition way wealthier than previous residents because they're able to afford these $1 million homes. But then I know that they have kids because I can see all of the toys in their yard, but I also know that they're not sending their kids to the school because literally the school is like 99% Black and Latinx. So I think sending children to the local public school is super important because that means that those resources that upper middle class people have access to are now being invested in those communities and then shared through these public resources. So that's just one example, but thinking about ways that we can share and leverage collective resources to improve communities instead of saying like, oh, we're going to take our resources and put them into, we're going to create this special school that's kind of just for us, and we'll let in a few students on scholarship. But instead of thinking like, what are the public resources that we can create and invest in for the community?
Our next question, I've talked to people who think a rise in home values is an absolute benefit to Black homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods. Can you speak to some of the detriments of rising home values in gentrifying neighborhoods for Black homeowners?
Yeah, and I thank you for that. And I think the story of the Hintons is just a classic example, but this happens over and over again. I look every time I look at like a real estate ad in Petworth, the home might be for sale for $1.3 million. But if you look at the history, you'll see that that home was bought for $25,000 or $50,000 and then sold for $400,000. And then a very short time later sold for $1.3 million. So you can see that the rise in home values is not benefiting the long-term residents. And the reason for that is because long-term residents often don't have the capital or the either the financial capital or the cultural capital to know how to reinvest in the house to renovate it in such a way that can now be sold for, there's a house close to where my parents live that's being sold for $2 million. And that house required not only hundreds of thousands of dollars of money to renovate it, but also just the knowledge that comes with like, what does a person that can afford a $2 million house, what do they want? So you have to kind of even know what they would be looking for. So we're seeing that this money, the rise in home values is primarily going to investors. It's not primarily going to the long-term buyers. And that's just the homeowning community, that they're mostly selling their homes. And then they're also, the other reason that it doesn't lead to wealth generation is a lot of the homes in Petworth were purchased in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. That's a long time ago. And usually it's the grandparents that own the home. And there's all kinds of reasons why their children born in the 70s and 80s and 90s weren't able to purchase homes. So by the time grandma is ready to pass along the house, there's like 10, 20 heirs. So even if the house is sold at a reasonable rate, it's being split up among a lot of heirs. And if it's split up among 10 people, that's not enough for any of those 10 people to then, reinvest in the neighborhood. But the increase in home values is also affecting renters, right? So when home values rise, so do rents. So it doesn't necessarily benefit the community in ways that we think it might. I mean, of course, there are occasions when people are able to benefit from this rise, but that's not the trend that we're seeing.
Great answer. We have a lot of questions, but I'm trying to pick some that are kind of different from the others. Are the explanations for the wealth gap in DC similar to other cities, or does Washington, DC's experience stand out as exceptional, and why might that be the case?
Yeah, I mean, the trends are very similar in pretty much any city that you look at. The wealth gap is tremendous, like multiple factors of difference. I think that, and the reasons are also going to be very similar in DC and as in other cities. So these trends that we see of cities becoming, DC was one of many cities that became majority Black in the 1970s and in the 1960s and 1970s. And we see a similar trend in those cities where the cities were kind of left, Black neighborhoods were kind of left disinvested and abandoned for decades. And then now we're seeing this back to the city movement is kind of also happening across the country for all kinds of reasons. So I think the trends are similar. The one thing that makes DC a little bit different than other cities is, or really a lot different, we're different from Detroit in that we didn't have a large industrial presence in the 1940s and 1950s. So DC didn't experience deindustrialization, and we do have the strong presence of the federal government, but the federal government also moved its offices to Northern Virginia and to Maryland. So we didn't have deindustrialization the same way, but we also did have a displacement of federal jobs to the suburbs. But the one thing that makes DC similar to Detroit, which a lot of people don't know, is that in 1970, DC and Detroit had the wealthiest, on average, Black middle class of any two cities in the country. So the highest, like the number of people making the number of Black people making over $100,000 in today's dollars in 1970 in Detroit and DC were the two highest in the country. So that's that's two ways that we're both similar from and different similar to and different from Detroit.
Good to know. Okay, we have a lot of questions about what you talked about towards the end of your talk with the decommodification of housing and housing as a human right. I think people are having trouble conceptualizing or thinking through like what that might look like. Do you have any insight into how that could occur or how we could work towards or envision housing as a human right?
Yeah, thank you. So we do have examples of this. So first of all, public housing is decommodification of housing and making housing a human right. And so thinking about the history of it, so many of you probably know that the Berry Farm dwellings was recently demolished. And I'm pretty sure DC Preservation League played a role in preserving that one little piece of it, which is super important. Because if you go and look at that one piece of Berry Farm that was preserved, what you'll see is that it's a nice place, right? Berry Farm dwellings was built intentionally as large apartments for families with kind of large green spaces in between. It was built as a walking community with little crisscrosses to cross over. And in the 1950s, it was highlighted as one of the examples of success of public housing in the country. Because so when public housing was first built in the United States, it was built segregated, but the Public Housing Authority did have the foresight to kind of imagine beautiful spaces. The Langston Terrace dwellings has a big terracotta frieze of Langston Hughes in it. So it's possible for the government to build beautiful, habitable places for people. And that's what it means to have housing as a human right. One way is by the government providing public housing. We do have this example of it. What happened with public housing is, which I didn't go into today, which is just disinvestment. The government stopped funding public housing, so then the housing itself started to deteriorate. The other example is the cooperative housing. So when you have cooperative housing, it's decommodifying it, it's taking it out of the financial market. So what we're seeing today is just the increased financialization of housing, whereby big corporations are buying up tons of housing, and for the sole purpose, not to live there, right? But for the sole purpose of producing profit. So what I'm talking about is reimagining, the housing market as not primarily a site of profit, but primarily as providing housing for people. And that can be done through public housing. It can be done through inclusionary zoning programs, and it can be done through cooperative housing developments where people are passing along the home to other families, but without the purpose of extracting profit, but instead the purpose of having a place to live.
Okay, I'll just have a few more questions for you. I know we have a lot, but so this question is about how governments balance or could better balance in the future investment in neighborhoods, community services, things of that nature, and law enforcement, and kind of what you see as the relationship between those two things and how that could be more equitable or better in the future.
Thank you. One thing to keep in mind is that the tremendous investment in law enforcement in the 1980s and 1990s, the primary material consequence was mass incarceration and heavy policing and sort of the creation of this carceral apparatus of the state. There's very little evidence that made communities safer. So I think, and right now in DC, we're obviously having this conversation about, there's a rise again in homicides and gun violence again in the city, which nobody is happy about. There's no contingency that's saying we're in favor of gun violence, right? So every single neighborhood in the city, every single ward in the city is saying we want to stop this gun violence. But there's almost no evidence that increasing law enforcement is going to reduce gun violence, right? So this is not a question that we can kind of just disentangle right here, but I think the point is, as a researcher myself, my hope is that the policies that are implemented in the city in the future are based on empirical evidence and not knee-jerk reactions, because we have this belief pretty strongly held societal belief that police officers make communities safer. But if you just think about it for 1 second, if someone robs you, the police officer is not going to prevent that, right? They're going to come afterwards and take a report, and they may or may not catch the person. But either way, you've still been robbed. You've still been violated, right? So police officers, law enforcement in the United States really has become reactive. And that makes us sort of feel like somebody's watching, but it has not reduced crime. So I think it's important to keep an open mind about this. And sort of as you're thinking about how we can balance public investment and carceral investment and how we can investment in public goods versus investment in carceral apparatuses, like what does the actual research say? And there's tons of research that says that, preschool for all, opening up more public spaces, improving education, all of those things reduce crime. Investing in the carceral apparatus there's very little evidence that it reduces crime.
I'll give you 2 more questions, and the last one is going to be easy, but this one is a question about, and we've had a few different questions about this, but are there groups that you know of that are active in working to further invest in neighborhoods, and are there ways that individuals, Black, white, whoever, can help with reinvesting in different neighborhoods in DC?
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's a number of ways that you can get involved. So there is a great organization called Empower DC, which has done really great work around affordable housing. So you could get involved. Empower DC has kind of local organizations in each ward that you could get involved in. The other way you can get involved really is, a lot of this really is happening at the micro local level. So getting involved with what's going on in your ANC, figuring out what's going on in your ward with your council member coming in and having conversations. So just sort of being there, being present for those conversations, and then also and doing what you can to make sure all voices are heard. So you may be in a position where your voice is generally heard, and just sort of recognizing that and taking time to listen and to participate mindfully in conversations. And you may be in a position where your voice isn't always heard, and thinking about ways that you can find people to work with to make sure that voices like yours are uplifted. So kind of depending on your positionality, thinking about how you can get involved in those conversations at the local level, I think would be super helpful.
Great answer. We've done some work with Empower DC as well. They're great. So the last question is hopefully an easy one. It's how can we pre-order your book or be notified when it comes out?
Oh, thank you. Good question. I'm going to set up a pre-order link soon. It's not, I'll set up that soon on my website, but if you check out my website, racismcapitalismlaw.com, I will have a pre-order and get informed link up there about the book. So thank you for asking. But you also can just follow me on social media, Tanya Golash-Boza on Twitter. I'll also announce it there.
Great. Yeah. And if you registered for this event, I'll send out some of the links and the recording to this webinar as well. But thank you so much, Tanya. This has been great. And I know that there are a lot of questions that we maybe didn't get to, but I think that we're out of time. So thank you so much. And I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you all for your conversations. And I look forward to more conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.